within your zip code, right? Which, especially for parents who have children who are underage, who may be vulnerable to being victimized, right? I think that's a right. Is a new method of social, at least attempting social control, right? And I think as jurisdictions have changed, right, we saw how the police, from the perspective of the police, right, at one time they just wrote the John a ticket, right? He was on his way. The hard thing is getting victims to cooperate to the full extension, as we clearly saw, right? So the concept of opportunity theory, right, especially illegitimate opportunity theory, is still very applicable in cases like this, in cases like drug dealing, right? In all kinds of trafficking, right? I mean, we could look at global criminal activity where many humans are victimized for body parts in underdeveloped and developing countries, right? Traffickers look at an individual based upon their physical appearance, based upon whether they're healthy or not, and in those eyes of those traffickers, they're looking at murdering the individual and then trafficking the body parts. Another heinous crime involving trafficking. Okay. We, over the weekend, or last week with the shootout in, what was the state in Mexico? It wasn't Sinaloa. But anyway, where El Chapo's son shot it out with the cops, right? And he escapes, and the weapons confiscated, right? At least, 6 of those AR-15s and AK-47s were traced to the state of Arizona, okay? So the drug dealers are providing the drugs, right, in many cases, in exchange for weaponry, right? And, again, it's a cat and mouse battle between law enforcement and these individuals who are, always seem to be one step ahead of the law, right? Now they're going back to tunnels, right? As 2 tunnels were uncovered, one in California and one in, I think, Nogales, right? The other thing is, I've read, is that these drug cartels are now investing in submarine technology, right? So they'll bring the drugs over in subs, So, I mean, they have millions of dollars. They virtually control these countries, right? Who's controlling El Salvador? Who's controlling Honduras? Who's controlling Guatemala? Who's controlling Mexico, right? And the cartels, right? I also read in the same light, the cartels are now investing their illegal money into legitimate businesses, like they're into the avocado business in Mexico. They said the major controller of avocados, which is again in demand in countries like ours, is run by the cartels. And the fact of that many institutions, both in those developing nations and the United States, financial institutions like major banks are involved, sometimes knowingly, other times unknowingly, in laundering the money that results from this type of illegal activity. So again, you wonder about control, the application of control theory regarding social bonds. Gottfried and Hershey's argument that without strong familial bonds, without values, norms, strong belief system, right, that emphasizes being a law-abiding citizen rather than criminal activity, has some impacts here. Right? It seems like Kat, as a victim, had a supportive family that stood behind her in every capacity. Many times these victims are result of unstable home social environments. A lot of these young girls are runaways, right? And very vulnerable to become victimized by the population, right? So the opportunity theory, right? And the control and social bonding supports control theory regarding many of these issues. But there's also a correlation in that section in other types of crime, such as corporate crime, white-collar crime, that when the opportunity exists, right, it doesn't matter the social class or the profession of an individual, they become vulnerable, right? And they use the example of white-collar criminals such as Bernie Madoff. Numerous, when we get to white-collar crime, possibly not today, we'll look at the top 5 white-collar crimes in the United States and globally, right? And they always, in most cases, involve people in positions of power, right? Who abuse their power, right? Who use their power, as Bernie Madoff did, to embezzle, defraud populations of extreme amounts of money, right? Again, the question, does the punishment fit the crime? When in many of these white-collar criminal sentences, we'll see a less severe sentence than someone who commits burglary or someone who commits some sort of theft, right? On an individual, on a lesser scale basis than the millions, tens of millions of dollars that Bernie Madoff defrauded out of his victims. So opportunity, again, knows no bounds, right, in the commitment of crime. Tax fraud, writing bad checks, right? Many times, again, as we move into conflict, right, the social structure in our capitalist economy, right, determines wealth, power, and prestige, right? And sometimes if we don't have legitimate means to achieve those standards in society, we turn to illegal activity to achieve them, as conflict theorists emphasize. So again, many of these theories that we're studying regarding crime and deviance are decades old, right? So the way society interprets crime, perceives crimes, and acts accordingly, right, seems to be a standard that still fits the observing theoretical applications like we're seeing here. Right? So in regards to conflict theories, many times there's a tie to power differentials, right? Those that have and those that do not have, or the haves versus the have-nots. Sometimes people in the middle, right? Looking at our class-based system, right? The book talks about the application of Thorsten Selin, right? Who back in the 1930s, during the end of the Depression and the rise of organized crime in American society, at a time where the US government determined, in the best interest of our society, we'd prohibit alcohol, right? Prohibition for about 5 years in the late 1920s, early 1930s, which opened the door for organized crime throughout the United States, right? Building their economic capital on bootlegging booze to a demanding public, right? So things that develop such as subcultures within a culture, like organized crime, right, And because, as discussed later, or a little bit further into the chapter, many times the mass media has influential capacities on subcultures, like the Italian mafia, right, who's been portrayed in numerous motion pictures. The Godfather immediately comes to mind, the television series The Sopranos, right, the classic Italian crime family, right, which has been globalized, right? Numerous ethnic populations are involved in organized crime, not just the stereotypical Italian mafia gangster that we see portrayed in the mass media. So subcultures can involve, as in the discussion, in the application by Selin, in regards to the cultural diverse population that we have, right? Immigrants coming from different parts of the world, bringing different social, structural, cultural foundations that reflect their specific identities, both as individuals and as members of the population, right? And there's some four examples there, how we perceive certain cultural issues as deviant more so than others. The book uses the example of certain populations around the world who still emphasized arranged marriages. And if you brought that structure to the United States, a capitalistic democracy based on foundations of liberty and freedom, that would deviate from the norm, right? Or, some instances that have cultural applications, right? That we don't practice in our society, we may see as deviant or even criminal, right? The example given in the book is certain Middle Eastern populations from North Africa using female circumcision as a medical outcome, right? Which would be considered probably criminal here in the United States. And we'll look at this a little bit more in detail as you will devote Wednesday to the learning activity, and then we'll conclude this chapter on a week from today, where we look at this growing concern in our country called hate crimes, right? Which has also been correlated with subcultures. White nationalists, neo-Nazis, the ever-present KKK, Ku Klux Klan is a subculture, right? This weekend, I forget the country, but the female was running with a hijab scarf in a high school track meet, and she set a state record, but she was disqualified for her headscarf, which is drawing a reaction from numerous populations. Again, does the sanction fit the activity, right? Should one be reprimanded for a cultural component that's part of their identity, right? So again, these subcultures and deviants, right, reflect. A couple of years ago, we were talking a lot about the LA-based gangs, right? The Blood and the Crips, right? That had, how would you say, like comparative to Major League Baseball, farm clubs in the Phoenix metropolitan area, right? I was asked to go into juvenile hall here on the reservation, right? And I found members on the reservation who were affiliated with the Bloods and the Crips, right? And my interaction with some of those individuals was intergenerational. An older relative had been a member of a gang, right? My uncle was a member of a gang, therefore I was influenced in my socialization to become a gang member, right? So subcultures can evolve, right, based upon the social environment, a lack of social bonding. Sometimes we're vulnerable, like young girls who are dissatisfied with their home environment and run away, right, and then become victimized in those criminal outcomes, in those criminal situations. Another power differential, right, class, as we have, or as I have emphasized, right, in our capitalist democratic society, right, that Marx looked at way back in the 1800s, is our social classes, right? Upper class, middle class, and lower class, right? And how sometimes class domination, capitalism's impacts on deviance, right? In that regard, Richard Quiney put forth this theory, which proposes that what is labeled deviant or criminal, and therefore who gets punished, is determined by the interests, many times, of the dominant class. For example, since labor is central to the functioning of capitalism, those who do not work will be labeled deviant, the unemployed, right? The social standard of hard work correlated with capitalism in our society. Capitalist impacts on deviance, right? The impact of theft or property, right, that we see as private, right, that becomes infringed upon when your car is stolen, right, when your house is broken into, right, when your private property is taken from you, right. That becomes a deviation of the norm in vain, that since private property is a key foundation of capitalism, those who engage in acts against property such as stealing, vandalism, not only will be labeled criminal, but the societal reaction looks at it as deviant and criminal. Unregulated market activities, again, coming back to our old example regarding prostitution, drug running, now cyber crimes, right, where the anonymity empowers certain individuals, right? And we clearly saw it in the piece there, right, where law enforcement used technology, internet technology, to get their criminals, right? And the vulnerability of participation by the offenders was clearly evident. They responded to everything the cops posted almost, right? For their sexual wants or their economic needs, whatever they were interpreted to be in those specific situations, right? The criticism of this theory is that it points out that the laws lack, that laws against the interests of the ruling class to get passed, laws prohibiting insider trading on the stock market, governing the labor practices of corporations, and giving workers the right to strike and form trade unions, were all signed over the strident opposition of big business, or which were once considered deviant at one time or another, right? As Marx, one of Marx's rallying cries was "Workers unite," or "Proletariats unite." Right? One of the foundations of union movements in the United States. The AFL-CIO, one of the oldest, the United Iron Workers Union, the Automobile Manufacturers Union, right? That unified workers' rights against the bourgeoisie, in other words, if we apply a Marxian perspective to class-dominant theories. And as our author, Chambliss, to incorporate these facts Chambliss proposed a structural contradiction theory that takes into account the limitations as well as the power of capitalist society. Right? So largely in looking at our first chapter with a conflict emphasis using the Marxian paradigms, right? We revisit it right here, right? Corporate America outsourcing to underdeveloped and developing nations to maximize profit at the expense of American society, right? Which with this unlevel playing field then creates a greater, as this theory emphasizes, a greater possibility for the increase of crime, right? As we hear currently, right, from our from this presidential administration that the economy is solidified, right? That more people are working now, unemployment is at some of its lowest rates in history, but how has that impacted the commitment of crime? Right? We still see, you know, and again, you know, I showed you the graphs the first day we addressed this topic, right? Violent crimes down, property crimes down, right? So again, we look at those structural contradictions, right? As we hear in capitalist economies between the need to maximize profit and keep wages down and the need to maximum consumption requires high wages. Consider a US business that to maximize profits keeps wages and salaries down by moving its factories to another part of the world where wages are low. As jobs move overseas, the availability of jobs to unskilled and semi-skilled workers in the United States declines. The loss of jobs produces downward pressure on wages and a loss of purchasing power, yet capitalism depends on people buying the things that are produced. Corporations cannot profit unless they sell their products. So we as consumers become entrapped in these global economic situations of outsourcing, globalization, right? Trapped in the contradiction between norms valuing consumerism and an economic system that can make consumption of desired material goods difficult to certain populations, right? And like we talked about, the accessibility to education, right? To more career-oriented employment as opposed to service-oriented employment, which is minimum wage and you know, minimal benefits for the employee, as opposed to one correlated with the greater degree of education, the greater degree of economic security, right? But if not everybody has access to the economic outcomes that the social structure perceives for the entire population, education's gonna be unbalanced, right? As we learn right now, the majority of students in college are middle class or better, right? The percentages of lower middle class and lower class there's a significant gap, right, in the process, which again will then draw these structural contradictions to the commitment of crime, again, leading to, like I said earlier, income tax evasion, writing bad checks, and profiting from illegitimate, illegal criminal markets that are out there. Right? Let's see. There's a comparison regarding structural contradictions, and we see that as a political debate right now, right? Certain Democratic political candidates, such as probably the most visible Bernie Sanders, right, who's advocating for free education at the college level, right, which some people see as socialism, right? The comparison with Scandinavia is that those nation states, despite being capitalist, provide that service to the general population, right? Provide socialist medicine to the general population, right? So that the consumer in those countries, right, has a greater standard of economic power. So it says societies such as Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, for instance, provide a social safety net that guarantees all citizens a decent standard of living. Therefore, poorer residents in Scandinavian countries are able to come much closer to what their societies has established as a normal standard of living. The fact that rates of assault, robbery, and homicide are anywhere from 3 to 35 times higher in the United States than in these Scandinavian countries. So again, is this a structural contradiction when we have a process in economics that eliminates certain percentages of the population and reinforces the standards for another segment of the population, right? We see that same argument regarding taxation. Should the rich pay a greater percentage of their tax base than they're currently paying, as opposed to people in the middle class, right? So if we reflect percentages, if you take in an economics class, maybe an macroeconomics class, these are the economic standards you look at globally, right? Those types of disparities and the services provided, right? Many times, because of lands that Native Americans ceded to this government historically over time. And these land cessions reflected in treaties that American Indian nations made with the United States government reflects a trust responsibility that the federal government has to uphold to Native American populations, right? And as a result of ceding land, right, giving up land to this government, they have provided different social services, such as federal subsidized health care. Many times the federal government will provide federal scholarship dollars to American Indian students, infrastructure for the reservation, right? And now the capitalist economic criticism is, well, these tribes have casinos, and do they need the tax dollar base for education? Do they need the tax dollar base for healthcare, right? Well, it's a misperception, because not all tribes that have casinos are making maximized profits as perceived from the general public, right? So again, an outside example of a structural contradiction in society, right? That, as a population, right, and we'll talk about this in race and ethnicity, right? The land base that was once Native American land has become Arizona, California, Utah, Colorado, etc. Right? Another, and we clearly saw this in the piece, is feminist theories, right? Again, the criticism of the feminist theories, starting with Harriet Martineau, regarding the patriarchal structure of our society, everything being run by men, right? A male bias in how deviance and crime is interpreted. Right? So the starting point of feminist explanations of deviance is the observation that studies of deviance have been biased because almost all the research has been done by and about males, largely ignoring female perspectives on deviant behavior, as well as the analysis of differences and types of causes of female violence. So let's see, we go back to a table at the end of the chapter. I think that's where it is, yes. And we look at incarceration rates. Again, using the dependent variable being incarceration, the independent variables being race and gender, right? So we see that the incarceration rates in the United States are clearly dominated by African American males, followed by Hispanics, whites, but look at the significant comparison, right, between the commitment of crime of women versus men in all racial categories, right? Similar numerical outcomes, but significantly lower, right? So, you know, are the social bonds, the socialization, the gender roles of females more defined toward less commitment of crime? Or why such a gross discrepancy, right? Feminists state by ignoring the female population, deviance theory has avoided one of the most challenging issues in the field. Why do rates of deviance, and especially criminal deviance, vary so greatly by gender? One of those, again, in this topic, another one of those million-dollar questions. So maybe, you know, if you use gender as an independent variable in your learning activity, we'll see similar patterns as we address your research on Wednesday, right? And is that pattern across the board in certain types of deviance? You know, the demand by males in prostitution, the victimization of females in prostitution has become a social standard, right? And again, the conflict, right, in the acceptance of solutions like legalization, right? Think of, again, I think I mentioned certain counties in Las Vegas where prostitution is regulated by the state, right? Those that provide the service are medically examined, right? So a lesser degree of STDs or negative medical outcomes is less of a possibility than getting it out on the streets, right? And these big social activities like we have, probably this, on a yearly basis, probably the biggest time that prostitution awareness and concern surfaces is every end of January, early February, when the Phoenix Open takes place.